welcome to the Magenta Edge Digital Workshop Series. I am so happy to have you here today. I am Lauren Rosa Miller, Director of Business Development for Mill3r Consulting, that my late father started the year before I was born, that I now run with my brother Dave Miller Jr. This is Workshop Series 6 of 8 that is taking place every Thursday up until April 1st. So make sure you definitely check out the tmobile.com/Magenta Edge website for all of the upcoming series and series that have already passed. And so today we'll be talking about the pathway to succession planning and generational longevity. And so there are a couple of housekeeping things before we dive in that I want to mention. The first thing is that T-Mobile Biz for Business will be live tweeting throughout the whole event. So make sure you join in the conversation and make sure to use the hashtag Magenta Edge. So let's go ahead and get started. And so like I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the pathway to succession planning and generational longevity. Welcome. And so a little bit about this course, we're going to be diving into like the foundational tools and resources that you need to be aware of to really pass down your small business to the next generation, to identify, the strategies needed to put in place to make sure you're able to sustain your businesses for generations to come. And so today's agenda, we're going to open up with an introduction. I'm going to share a little bit more about myself and why I am here to speak with you about this today. The first lesson will be about the actual steps to succession planning and responsibility transfer. Lesson 2 will be how to reinvest in your community. And lesson 3 will be about long-term positioning. So who am I? I'm an entrepreneur, storyteller, thought leader in the areas of legacy building and global citizenship. Like I mentioned, I currently serve as a director of business development for Mill3r Consulting. It's a management consulting firm. We specialize in procurement disparity studies, inclusive policy initiatives, and opportunity creation for minority and women-owned businesses. I also serve as the CEO and founder of my company, Mill3r Co., which is a publisher and a house of brands that serve millennials through media, education, events, and merchandise. But the real reason that I think I want to share this with you guys is that I am a steward of my family's legacy. I am the daughter and granddaughter, great-granddaughter of entrepreneurs. You could say that entrepreneurship runs in my veins, in my DNA. And not until my father got sick, probably about 2014-15, did I really understand the magnitude of my family's legacy, our lineage, and our history, and what the importance of succession planning and passing on that baton is really for. And so I'm excited today to use my experience as a case study to share more about this information, to make sure that we really are preserving and securing our businesses and legacies for generations to come. So let's dive on in. And so what's the definition of succession planning, right? So you may have heard the word succession typically means at the end. And so it really is a strategy for passing on leadership roles, often the ownership of your company, to a successor, an employee, group of employees. And so this ensures that the business continues running once this person has retired or passed away. And so lesson 1, we're going to go into the actual steps that you need to take in order to do succession planning. And so one of the quotes that I oftentimes tell people, because I think when you think about generational legacy and building wealth, you can get and feel very overwhelmed by the responsibility. And so the goal is to build a foundation, not burn out trying to do everything during your leg of the race. You need to leave time to nurture the next generation. Remember that generational longevity and wealth is built over generations, not just one. So I hope for you guys who are out there that feel like you are the first everything, you understand what this truly means. And also, don't let death or sickness be the catalyst to your succession planning. In my case, sickness was the catalyst for us to get things going. And luckily, God willing, we had 4 years to prepare. But I really want us to change our thinking around this type of instruction and this intentional planning, such that you're not dealing with this under the stress of sickness or death. And so step one is really developing the right mindset, right? Really getting deep clarity on your what and your why. Why do you want to transfer this business? Why do you want to make it to the next generation? What does that really look like, right? And then the other thing to really think about too is succession planning is a process. It's not a one-time event. It's not going to be, a retreat for a weekend. This is a process, and you have to treat it as such. And so you have to wrap your mind around what that may look like. The other thing is to have a positive outlook, right? Believe your business can make it to the next generation. Think about the process, because this is really life-giving to the next generation that comes after you. So it can really be more about really dreaming of the future versus the morbid thought around the end of life. So the next step is start early. We already know the day-to-day responsibilities of running a small business. So if you tack on needing to do the intentional planning of succession planning, you want to start as early as possible, so that you can really dedicate the time needed. And so generally, depending on how big your operation, so if you have a multi-million dollar, thousands of employees, you want to start, I would say, 7 to 10 years in advance. For your smaller businesses, I would say a minimum of 3 to 4, because you want to give your child or your successor enough time to learn the business, develop the management skills, learn from you, and then also get whatever documentation that's required in place. And that simply just takes time. Step 3 is seeking out counsel. Once you have kind of determined what your vision is, you can bring in service providers to help, right? So you may find that you don't have the time to have such a hands-on approach to create all of the documentation. And so somebody like a management consultant could come in and assist you with building out that implementation plan, building out the structure of how the training needs to go, or what things need to be put in place to get you from point A to point B, as well as financial planners and bankers and lawyers, whatever facets of your business that you believe needs counsel for in this process. I definitely recommend that you seek out counsel. And step 4, setting a realistic timeline and expectations and outlook. And so, the reality is this is a process. And I keep on reiterating that, because I want people to know that this is, like I said, this is not an overnight type situation. The factors to consider, you want to consider the process of creating your plan. So this is getting your vision out of your mind. That takes time. Sitting with yourself, sitting with the idea of your business, sitting with the idea of what you want this to be, what's required, then the actual implementation of the plan, the actual training that it takes, like I mentioned before, getting whatever paperwork and things in place that are needed, and then the actual transfer process itself. And what does that look like? And so these are all things to think about when you're setting your expectations around the time that it's going to take. Step 5, train the next generation. So that first bullet point is very important, right? Presenting business ownership as an option and not an obligation. And so oftentimes when you think about family business, there's always, the younger generation that feels very pressured to step up to follow in their parents or their mother's footsteps. But what you want to do is present that as an option, and even talk about how you don't necessarily have to manage the business. You can own the business. So there's a difference between, owning and operating and just owning. The other thing is to encourage outside employment and education and experience. And so, for example, for me, my first entrepreneur endeavor was Can't Stay Put, which took me around the world, building relationships, building my communications experience. I'm now able to use that experience in the family business. Same with my brother, him having experience working for municipalities. That all adds to the value that we're able to bring. And it also gives your successors a way to create their own identity outside of, their parent or whoever that they're, taking on this legacy from. Also, you want to designate an area of responsibility or focus. Just because they are your successor or your child doesn't mean they can do every role. And so you really have to see what are their capabilities, what is their aptitude, and really attach them to the role that makes the most sense. Invest in building skills and further education and certifications. And so a part of creating this plan is understanding the gap that may be there to get your child or your successor to the space that they need to be qualified and to have the skill set needed to execute their upcoming position. And also open your networking contacts. I know for me, when I was going through this process with my father, anybody that he knew, he would make a point to introduce me and just start to open up that conversation, such that at some point he knew that I would be taking on that relationship solely. And so the sooner you start, the better, because you don't, want the gravity of that when you're talking to these people, like, this is the end of life planning, succession planning. I want you to know who my daughter is. And so that's why time is really needed to do this very intentionally. And so step 6 is documenting the process, right? And, you can use one of 3 ways. I recommend all 3. And, this is also securing one's legacy as well, right? And so I know that this workshop is through the lens of passing on a small business, but this is a part of your legacy, right? And so whether that be in written form, I know in our experience, I wrote out a series of various different questions that I wanted my father to answer, and he answered them via audio. And so some of the questions he answered in long form, we did record. And so we used all 3 of these options. And so even in the audio sense, I had my father, when he was having conversations, business conversations, or working through challenges, I encouraged him to record that, because that gives us an understanding of how to think about certain issues, how to deal with certain things. And no, we're not necessarily taking his position, right? But you want to be armed with that walk around knowledge when you are continuing on that family business. And step 7, memorialize the transfer. Set a date and execute that transfer. And so, like I mentioned before, that can look like a multitude of things. That doesn't mean that, for most small business owners, they will tell you that they don't ever see themselves truly retiring, right? But that doesn't mean that you won't get out the day-to-day weeds of your business and maybe pursue other ventures, right? And so, you have to get to that step where you have to let go and let that next generation take ownership and give them the leeway to take on and lead. And so just to recap these steps, the first step is developing the right mindset. And that's with anything. You can't really get through this process without having a true understanding of your what and your why. The second is starting early. The earlier, the better. Step 3 is seeking counsel, whether that's accountants, bankers, lawyers. Number 4 is setting a timeline, expectations, and outlook around the process, and just being clear and realistic with that timeline. Step 5 is to train the next generation. And, this is one of those really instructional time to spend with your successor or your kids, really training up that generation, and you will find that you get a lot of joy out of that experience. Number 6 is documentation. Make sure you're documenting, whether that be audio, visual, or written form. And number 7, that's memorializing that transfer, whether that's a matter of a signature, if you have a date, like this is it. And so that's step 7. And now we're going to move into lesson 2, how to reinvest in the community. And so this is definitely a part of how you maintain that generational longevity and position yourself. And so here's some key ways, right? Workforce, economic development, civic and political engagement, and philanthropy. And so we're going to dive into each of these four areas to kind of give you a little bit more background about how they play a role in reinvesting in your local community. But I want to open up with this one stat from census data that stated that there were about 2 million Black owned businesses in America. And of that number, 124,000 of those firms were considered employer firms, which means they had employees beyond just a proprietor. And so out of those 124,000 firms, they employ close to 1 million people and have a total annual payroll of $23.9 billion. So you just think about the magnitude that Black owned businesses have in our communities and the need for growth and the need for resources to create more Black owned businesses in our community. And so the first thing on how to reinvest in your community is workforce. And so employment, hiring people within your community, right? And so that is a direct way. You're hiring, that's a salary. You're changing and having an impact on the workforce within your city limits. Also apprenticeship. And so if you have a small business with the trade, and so trades are becoming very, very hot right now because people are in need of, trade plumbers or whatever the trade may be. And so developing an apprenticeship to connect young people within your community to mentorship and having an opportunity to learn from people on your staff and people within your business. And here's just a small business stat in general. And I'm sure a lot of you may know this, but currently 60.6 million small business employees in the US, which makes up approximately half of the United States workforce. So that's the power of small business. I know we talk a lot about these major big corporations, but you see here that it's small businesses that put us to work oftentimes. And so the second way to invest in your community is through economic development. And that first bucket, growth and innovation. So what does that mean? By you just existing, right? You being competitive, you are sharpening your skill set, you're creating competition in the marketplace and creating innovation in that marketplace by advancing the way that you provide your service, advancing the development of that product, as well as job creation, like I mentioned before. But also with growth, the growth of your business may lead to a brick and mortar. It may lead to more office space. It may lead to developing various different things within your community, which is hiring more people. It's serving more people in your community. Also supplier diversity. So if you have a purchasing arm of your organization where you outsource some of your work and you need vendors, supplier diversity is a great way to build economic development within your community because you're now partnering with other businesses on projects. And all of this is creating the goodwill needed to create this generational longevity in long-term positioning. And so one of my favorite quotes by my father is, somebody can't do everything, but everybody can do something. And so that leads to civic and political engagement, right? And so I truly believe we all have a responsibility, whether you're a business owner or not, to be an advocate in your community, especially if you are a business owner, because you have a platform, you are in a leadership position, and people ideally will listen to you. And so whether that looks like developing initiatives, taking a look at your company culture and identifying, what are some initiatives within the people within your company, that would be something for you guys to back and get behind. And, participating in local events, standing up to various political issues, and just creating that goodwill within your community through civic engagement. And last but not least, philanthropy. Oftentimes, small business owners think that, if they haven't hit, that 7-figure mark or, whatever their various goals are, that they're not big enough to give. And that's just simply not true, right? And so what that looks like is flat out giving money or offering your services pro bono or your products pro bono. That can also serve as a level of market research for your company too, because oftentimes, when you are giving, you are creating that goodwill and that good karma to come back. But also when you're offering your services for free, you're able to gauge and get feedback, right, on how you can make things better. And so there's always value in giving. And so again, volunteer and promoting volunteerism within your organization. And so as a recap, these are the 4 key ways to reinvest in your community, which is workforce, hiring, employment, apprenticeship, mentorship. The second way is economic development, and that's through growth, innovation, supplier diversity. The third is civic and political engagement, whether that is, being active at your city council, speaking up on issues, developing initiatives. The last is philanthropy, giving back. There's the power of the purse, opening up and, offering up your time and resources to provide value to people within your community. And so lesson 3, long-term positioning. So the first way to establish long-term positioning is relationships. You hear it in so many facets of business, but building relationships is so key. And building relationships with your community stakeholders. So who are they? Other business owners, advocacy leaders, leaders of nonprofits, your local politicians, and civilians who are just active. This creates that goodwill. You need relationships and you need people to call on through the ebbs and flows of your business, right? We see during COVID-19 that, we're upon just a different experience. And so you have seen different communities rally around local businesses and kind of think about different ways that can keep these local businesses alive. That comes from building these relationships within your community. And so they're very, very important to having the support you need to create long-term positioning. The second thing is to do frequent business assessments, right? In this day and age, you have to assess your business, through different market trends, the assessing new growth opportunities, investing in research and development, and just really having a keen understanding of your industry and where your industry is going and how you may need to change how you operate or how you sell or what you sell because the given industry that you're in, because you're thinking long term. The third is ownership and equity, right? One of the challenges that a lot of brick and mortar businesses face, particularly Black-owned businesses, is gentrification and displacement. Oftentimes we are leasing and renting our brick and mortar spaces and such that when the rent increases go up, we're not able to sustain. And so that's why ownership and equity is so key, right? So seeking out ownership of commercial and residential real estate. And so that doesn't mean you may have to start off leasing, right? But understanding that the goal is to get to ownership and equity. And so even outside of your specific business, how are you investing in other Black and brown businesses, right? How are you acquiring assets to sustain your business footing? And the last thing is really assessing and integrating need-based solutions into your business portfolio. Like I mentioned before, I think we've seen and learned from COVID-19 that business owners need to be in a position to adapt during uncertain times. And one of the ways to do this is to really think about whether or not aspects of your business or revenue generation is need-based, meaning that no matter what the circumstance is, your product or service is needed. And if for any reason that you find that it isn't need-based, then think about how you may diversify your portfolio, how you may think about creating another, revenue stream or figuring out another way so that you have a need-based source of revenue, whether that's within that small business or something that you need to create outside of that. And so I think that's very key to long-term positioning. And so just a short recap. The first thing was building relationships with your community stakeholders as business owners, civic leaders, politicians. 2, frequent business assessments. You are trying to assess your business against market trends and growth opportunities. Number 3 is ownership and equity. Owning, having equity in other small businesses. Number 4, assessing and integrating need-based solutions into your portfolio. And so those are really 4 major ways to ensure long-term positioning of your small business. We're going to go into some live Q&A, and I'm excited to answer some of these questions. What is a great way to encourage my teenager and sisters, young adults, to assist in our consulting business? We are still at the starting line, so tips on how to foster excitement. I would say, I will be honest, right? So it took me a while to understand the magnitude and the opportunity, right? But now, when I tell people and I say that, I've only worked for myself and or family, right? That's a blessing, right? I've never been in a situation where I have not been validated. So when you're talking to your daughter or your sisters, I believe you said your sister's kids, really tell them the power of working for somebody that looks like you, the power of being able to create something out of nothing, right? The power to continue that on, but also for them to see themselves in what that looks like. Because I know early on, I wasn't as excited to jump into the family business. And to be honest, that wasn't a part of my plan. But then I started to see who I was and what I bring to the table and how that can take the business to the next level. And so I think oftentimes when it comes to this dynamic, the next generation, they want to be individuals. They want to feel like, I am somebody outside of the shadow of my parent, my mom, my father. And so, be mindful of how they can kind of create their individualism, but also make them understand the magnitude of what they can potentially be involved in. And so just even using my family story as a case study, right? I can trace our, equity ownership back over 100 years, right? There's a sense of pride that I have. I walk different. I talk different. So I can go on a tangent, but let me answer some more questions. Is there a national movement to change the Black legacy narrative? I don't know, but I may be leading it. I think that, I'm on a mission to change that narrative for sure. And I also just want to speak to, we're the Black community, we're not all first generation. Oftentimes we're in the position of restoring our legacies, right? And continuing our legacies, because oftentimes some of us really don't know our history, and it's not our fault, but we don't need to go on that soapbox, right? But for me, I want to bring this conversation to the national stage because our legacies are important. Oftentimes we feel like we're starting from scratch, and we're not. You don't know that your great uncle had that grocery shop on the corner. You don't know, and you can draw power and pride and strength from that. So I advocate these discussions because I want to empower us, to understand the magnitude of what we're dealing with, but also to arm us with the resources to secure our legacies, because we still would live within a society that, has systematic racism in so many structures of society. And so if we're not very intentional about securing our legacy, it can wither away. Thank you guys so much for your questions. Thank you so much for tuning in. This has been so much fun. And so if you want to find me outside of this, you can definitely tune in on Instagram. You can follow me at Lauren Rosa Miller. Also my site, laurenrosamiller.com. But yes, this has been great. Thank you.